honest. Welcome everyone. My name is Maarten van Essen. I'm the program director of the John Adams Institute. And as probably a lot of you know, the John Adams Institute is an independent organization without subsidy, and we are able to do what we do with the generous support of many people who are here in the venue tonight as well. And one of those organizations that support us as well is the Goede Doelen Loterij. And tonight you are here in their brand new head office here on the Beethovenstraat. And let me start off by thanking the Goede Doelen Loterij for their hospitality of hosting us here. With You Know You Want This, Kristen Roupenian has written a collection of short stories which I enjoyed immensely. And it gives a wonderful look at the power dynamics between men and women. But it's also a very funny book. This afternoon, when Kristen Roupenian gave a talk at a school for high school students, and she read the last story of a book called Biter, she had many laughs from the kids there in the school. So it's a story. There are stories about men and women and the dynamics between them, but it's also a book which makes you laugh many times. I won't say much more about the book because, of course, Kristen Roupenian as well as the book will be properly introduced by tonight's moderator, Els Kragenbuur. First, I'd like to thank publishing house Nieuw-Amsterdam for working with us, for bringing Miss Roupenian to the John Adams. And as we often ask you all, if you do master the Dutch language, to buy the Dutch edition of the book. Without Dutch publishing houses, we are not able to do the work that we do. They invest a lot of money and a lot of work in translating the American, in this case, American language novels. And it's up to us to support this, otherwise, over time, we won't be there anymore. The same goes for the bookstores. I will say, buy your books at a proper bookstore instead of buying them online. So there's that. I would like to thank, with the Dutch translation, of course, translator Jardine Steeman, and I think, right, saying it well. Can you please stand up? If you like. So translated the book. Thank you for the job, well done. People who know the John Adams and have been to events before know the structure of our events. Els Kragenbuur, the moderator, will introduce Kristen Roupenian. Then Kristen will read a bit from one story, I don't know which one it will be. And then there will be a moderated discussion with, of course, a lot of plenty of room for you to ask questions. As said, and I'll finish up now, tonight's moderator is Els Kragenbuur. She is a writer and a journalist, born in the US but raised in the Netherlands. Els has written 2 books, a novel and a collection of stories, and has just now released a new book called De Kok, de Boerin, haar advocaat en dierverpleegster. It is kind of hard to translate. The cook, the farmer, her lawyer, and her nurse. It's a series of interviews with powerful women with long careers in different professions who had to compete and fight to get to where they are today. Please give Els Kragenbuur a warm welcome.
Hi, welcome everybody. I read Kristen Roupenian's Cat Person for the first time in the same week. I got asked twice how many Me Too experiences I had in my life. How many, not if I had any. I read it again because somebody, a former US correspondent journalist who I have known for 100 years, sent it to me with the words, "This is going to be huge. And by the way, was I ever this oblivious?" The next day I read it again because my first boyfriend, who is now gay, sent it to me with the words, "I think you'll like this story." I did like it, a lot. I still do. And it did become huge. In fact, it was the second best read New Yorker piece of 2017, which is a tremendous accomplishment, especially for a young writer who just finished an MFA program for creative writing. Personally, I don't think it is a controversial story. It makes perfect, honest, naked sense to me. But it did provoke a controversy. Or, as they say, Cat Person went viral. Hundreds of thousands of people all over the world felt the urge to come forward with their opinion, jubilant or trashing. The grey field was, as often happens in the middle of a hype, scarcely entered. People took Cat Person personally and made it personal by shoving Kristen herself in the image of Margot, the main female character, like she just went online with a shocking piece of her diary about an unpleasant sexual encounter, as many people were in fact doing at the time, to shame and to liberate and to be liberated. That said, her story would also have had an impact without Me Too. Cat Person comes really close, not for everyone in the most agreeable way. It reminds us of our eagerness to please and be pleased, about how we deal with rejection, back and forth, about voluntary sex, which turns out to be also shitty, plain, cliché, hideous, painful, or all of the above sex. Sex, which might make you wonder, how in the world could that have been voluntary? And maybe, just maybe, for some, it's easier to swallow all that self-confrontation when they make themselves believe that Kristen is Margot. I never thought about the question mark of autobiography while reading Cat Person. Like with any story of remarkable quality, I got sucked into it, and I only thought about who wrote it after I finished it. Way after. And even then, I never considered if Margot was Kristen, or her sister, or her best friend. But now that I do think about it, I think it might actually be a compliment. Margot comes across as a real person. Funny too, by the way. And she's the centerpiece in a story of which you can say, easy reading is hard writing. It's a piece of work, in a good way. I did think about Kristen, following the wave of uninvited commentary, about how that must change her life. It did, of course, change things for her. There's no way around it. With a 7-figure book deal, an HBO series adapting You Know Who You Want Is, and reviews in the world's most important newspapers, which would otherwise not have paid much attention to the umptiest short story collection of a recently graduated MFA student. But Kristen is still that young writer, and I'm very curious to hear more about her and her writing.
Hello. Haha, here we go. All right. Well, now that you can hear me, thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to the John Adams Institute for hosting, and to us for that gorgeous introduction. It made me have all these feelings before I was ready to start having them. So now I'm a little shaken up. I hope we'll have a chance to talk a lot more about some of the questions that you raised. I am now, as promised, going to read a little bit from the book. I think I am going to, I know that I'm going to read from the same story that I read from this morning, the story called Biter. As you heard, a group of high schoolers thought that the story was quite funny. You may find it very serious, and you should also feel free to have that experience if you want. I'll probably read for about 10 or 12 minutes, not too long. I think kind of short and sweet is how it works for public readings, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation afterwards. So, with no further ado, the story is called Biter. Ellie was a biter. She bit other kids in preschool, bit her cousins, bit her mom. By the time she was 4 years old, she was going to a special doctor twice a week to work on biting. At the doctor's, Ellie made 2 dolls bite each other, and then the dolls talked about how biting and being bitten made them feel. Ouch, one said. Sorry, said the other. I feel sad about that, said the one. I feel happy, said the other. But sorry again. She brainstormed lists of things she could do instead of biting, like raise her hand and ask for help, or take a deep breath and count to 10. At the doctor's suggestion, Ellie's parents put a chart on Ellie's bedroom door, and Ellie's mom put a gold star on it for every day Ellie didn't bite. But Ellie loved biting, even more than she loved gold stars, and she kept on biting, joyfully and fiercely, until one day, after preschool, pretty Katie Davis pointed at Ellie and whispered loudly to her dad, "That one's Ellie. No one likes her. She bites people." And Ellie felt so sick with shame, she didn't bite anyone again for more than 20 years. As an adult, though her active biting days were behind her, Ellie still indulged in daydreams in which she stalked her coworkers around the office, biting them. For example, she imagined sneaking into the copy room where Thomas Whitcomb was collating reports, so engrossed in his task that he didn't notice Ellie creeping up behind him on all fours. "Ellie, what on earth?" Thomas Whitcomb would cry in the final seconds before Ellie sunk her teeth into his plump and hairy calf. For while the world had succeeded in shaming Ellie out of biting, it couldn't make her forget the joy of tiptoeing behind Robbie Kettrick while he was standing at the craft table, smugly stacking blocks. Everything is normal, quiet, boring, then here comes Ellie, chomp. Now Robbie Kettrick is screaming like a baby, and everybody is scrambling and yelling, and Ellie is no longer just a little girl, but a wild creature, pacing the halls of the preschool, sowing chaos and destruction in her wake. The difference between children and adults is that adults understand the consequences of their actions, and Ellie, as an adult, understood that if she wanted to pay her rent and keep her health insurance, she could not run around biting people at work. Therefore, for a long time, Ellie did not seriously consider biting her coworkers, not until the office manager died of a heart attack at lunch in front of everyone, and the temp agency sent Corey Allen to replace him. Corey Allen. Later, Ellie's coworkers would ask each other, what on earth had the people at the temp agency been thinking sending him? Green-eyed, blonde-haired, pink-cheeked Corey Allen did not belong in an office environment. Corey Allen, like a faun or a satyr, belonged in a sunlit field surrounded by happy naked nymphs, making love and drinking wine. As Michelle in accounting put it, Corey Allen gave off the distinct impression he might, at any second, decide to quit being an office manager and run off to live in a tree. Ellie, who was something of an outcast at work, often walked in on hushed conversations about Corey Allen that presumably centered around how much the other women in the office wanted to sleep with him. Corey Allen was beautiful and fey. Ellie didn't want to have sex with Corey Allen. Ellie wanted to bite him. Hard. She discovered this while watching Corey Allen place glazed donuts on a platter before the Monday morning meeting. When he'd finished arranging the donuts, he turned around and, noticing her staring at him, winked. "Why, Ellie, you look hungry," he said with a leer. Ellie had not been checking out Corey Allen the way he seemed to be implying. She hadn't even been thinking about the donuts. But suddenly, she found herself imagining what it would be like to lock her jaws onto the soft part of Corey Allen's neck. Corey Allen would yelp and sink to his knees, that entitled look wiped right off his face. He'd slap weakly at her and cry, "Oh no, Ellie, stop, please, what is going on?" But Ellie wouldn't answer, because her mouth would be too full of Corey Allen's sweet and gamey flesh. Not that it had to be his neck. She wasn't picky about location. She could bite Corey Allen on his hand, or his face, or his elbow, or his ass. Each would have a different taste, a different mouthfeel, a different proportion of bone to fat to skin. Each would be, in its own way, delectable. Maybe I will bite Corey Allen, Ellie thought after the meeting. Ellie worked in communications, which meant that she spent 90% of her time crafting emails that no one ever read. She had a savings account and life insurance, but no lover, no ambition, no close friends. Her entire existence, she sometimes felt, was premised on the idea that pursuing pleasure was less important than avoiding pain. Perhaps the problem with adulthood was that you weighed the consequences of your actions too carefully in a way that left you with a life you despised. What if Ellie did bite Corey Allen? What if she did? What then? That night, Ellie changed into her nicest pajamas, lit a candle, and poured herself a glass of Cabernet. Then she uncapped a pen, opened her favorite notebook, and turned to a fresh page. Reasons not to bite Corey Allen. 1, it is wrong. 2, I could get in trouble. She nibbled on the tip of her pen, then added 2 subsidiary points. Reasons not to bite Corey Allen. 1, it is wrong. 2, I could get in trouble. A, I could get fired. B, I could get arrested or fined. Ellie thought, if it meant that I could bite Corey, I would not mind getting fired. For the past year and a half, she'd spent most of her lunch hour, most days, on her phone, swiping through job postings on monster.com. She was ready for a new position and felt perfectly well qualified for one. However, finding a new job after quitting your old one was not the same as finding a new job after you'd been fired from your old job for biting. Would it be impossible to get a new job in those circumstances, or merely very difficult? It was hard to know. Ellie sipped her wine and turned her attention to B, I could get arrested or fined. Well, that was certainly a possibility, but the truth was that if a woman bit a man in an office environment, there would be a strong assumption that the man had done something to deserve it. If, for example, she went up to Corey and bit him in full view of everyone at Monday morning meeting, and then later, when they asked her why she'd done it, and she answered sexual gratification, then yes, she'd probably be arrested. But if instead she bit Corey in private, say in the coffee room, and when they asked her why she'd done it, she said, he tried to touch me inappropriately, or even, so as not to mar his reputation, he came up behind me and scared me, I bit him instinctively, I'm so sorry, then people would probably give her the benefit of the doubt. When you got right down to it, as a young white woman without a criminal record, Ellie probably had at least one get-out-of-jail-free card. As long as she spun some semi-reasonable story, she would be believed. In fact, Ellie thought, as she stretched out her legs and refilled her glass of wine, there was another possibility for how all this could play out. What if she went up to Corey in private and bit him, and the experience was so bizarre that he didn't tell anyone about it because he had trouble believing it himself? Imagine, it's late in the afternoon, past 5, dark already, the office is empty. Everyone but Corey and Ellie has gone home. Corey is loading paper into the Xerox machine when Ellie enters the room. She stands behind him, inappropriately close. He thinks he knows what is coming. He stiffens, preparing to politely reject her, not because he has standards for workplace propriety, but because he's already hooking up with Rachel in HR. Ellie, he begins, apologetically, as she grabs his forearm and lifts it to her mouth. Corey's lovely face contorts, first in shock, then pain. Stop it, Ellie, he cries out, but no one hears him. The tendons of his arm roll and snap beneath Ellie's jaws. Finally, Corey gathers his wits enough to shove Ellie away. She stumbles backward, lands against the stacks of copy paper, and slides to the ground. Corey stares at her in horror, clutching his bleeding arm. He's waiting for her explanation, but she gives him none. Instead, she stands up calmly, straightens her skirt, and wipes the blood from her mouth before she leaves the room. What does Corey do? Of course, he could run straight to HR and say, Ellie bit me, but after all, it was an office, not a preschool. Everything about the conversation would be ridiculous. Ellie, did you bite Corey? They would ask. And Ellie would raise her eyebrows and say, no, what a weird question. If the HR people tried to push and said, Ellie, these are serious allegations, all Ellie would have to say was, yeah, seriously insane. Of course I did not bite the office manager, and I don't know why he's saying that I did. Really, the odds were high Corey wouldn't say anything at all. He would stay in the copy room for a while, contemplating the situation, and then, the next day, he'd decide the easiest thing to do would be to pretend it hadn't happened. He'd show up to work in a long-sleeved shirt to cover the ugly bruise on his arm, the little half-moon where she'd marked him with her teeth. And then, part of Corey Allen's brain would be reserved for keeping track of where, exactly, Ellie was. She'd catch him looking at her in meetings, and when they were at office parties together, he'd continually be moving, trying to keep as far as possible away from her. In a way, it'd be like they were always dancing, even if he never spoke to her again. Months later, when no one else was watching, she'd grin and snap her jaws at him, and he'd turn ghost pale and hurry from the room. He would remember her for the rest of his life. They'd be joined by the glistening strands of his spear. Later that night, the sweat drying on her body, her legs tangled in the sheets, Ellie forced herself to go back out into the living room and get her notebook. Fantasies were fantasies, but it was important to keep at least one foot in the realm of the real. She got back into bed and opened the notebook and rewrote her list. Reasons not to bite Corey Allen. 1, it is wrong. 2, it is wrong. 3, it is wrong. 4, it is wrong. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's great. Thanks. Want some over?
Yeah, sure.
Funny because the John Adams Institute asked me in preparation for this conversation, well, maybe it's a good idea at some point that you pick a part of the book, a part of the story that you would like to read her too. And it was exactly the same part.
Yeah.
Except shorter.
Mm-hmm.
Actually just the part where she just formed a list and she contemplates, well, as a woman, well, I can get away with this.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, I picked that part because it links actually quite well to Cat Person,
Mm-hmm.
because it's in some way almost a paradox to the sort of the victim that a woman can make herself be, or she can be in a certain sexual situation.
Yeah, I think the book does a lot of playing around with the idea of the way that people negotiate the roles of victim and aggressor, and like the stories they tell themselves about what role they're playing at any given time. And I think that one thing about Margot, in terms of her understanding of the situation that she's in, Margot in Cat Person, is that she moves really rapidly from feeling as though she's in total control of the situation, and that, you know, the date that she's on is going really well, and the guy is eating out of her hands, and he's totally into her, to feeling totally powerless, and to feeling like she doesn't have the ability to say what she wants, or to get what she wants, or to be, you know, to be on the kind of date that she would wishes she was on. And I think that kind of rapid movement between one role and another is part of why the whole experience for her feels so stabilizing, so destabilizing. And I also think, yeah, in Biter, is similarly, Ellie understands that the thing that she wants, which is such a like absurd and extreme thing to want, is so out of the bounds of the ordinary that it kind of upends the normal stories that people tell about the kinds of things that a woman might want. And that she recognizes that in some ways allows her to slide through the cracks, right? And to maybe move a little more freely than she otherwise would be able to do. And not to give the story away, but like that's a big part of the arc of the story, is her trying to figure out, like, is there a way that I could turn that to my advantage? Are there kind of spaces for me to move where I can maybe get what I want?
And you would never get away with biting a woman.
No, and I mean, I think whether as a woman realistically you could get away with fighting a man is maybe more of an open question.
Yeah.
But I do think, yeah, and that's true of a lot of the stories. In terms of readers' responses to them, I've had many people come up to me after having read the story and say something like, It took me longer to realize that one character or another was a monster because the character was a woman. Do you know what I mean? That there's a story like Scarred where she's literally keeping a man in her basement and torturing him. And I think you sort of go along with it. Probably like, yeah, but, you know, he's maybe not even real, you know, and she seems nice. You know, like, that the stories can kind of trick you into not seeing the world so clearly, which is what stories can so often do.
Yeah, definitely. And it also in Cat Person, the story which made you famous in one day. I think me personally also, I sympathize also with the man, because I think she knows what she's doing, and the whole idea, which was also a lot of it was going on online, that women are sort of forced in a situation where they also culturally and socially that they don't feel free to say no when the encounter hits a point where there's no aggression and there's no hitting and there's no real sort of rape situation or anything going on, but they still feel that they can't say no and they actually don't want to go through with it. And
I guess I have a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, I think one thing about Robert, and people ask me a lot about how much sympathy they're sort of allowed to have for Robert, and I have, like, I am agnostic. Like, I allow people to have whatever amount of sympathy they want to have for Robert. I think the story supports a large range of interpretations, but I think something that's really important to keep in mind about Robert is that we don't ever see him outside of Margot's perspective. Everything we know about him, we know through her. Yeah. And her own sympathy for him also is swinging wildly, sort of in conjunction with that sense of power and powerless. When she feels powerful, he seems like a sympathetic character to her. And when she feels trapped, he seems almost monstrous. Yeah. And she can't quite work her way through those competing narratives in order to see him. And I think that's part of why, as a reader, we struggle to see him, because we can only get these little glimpses of him.
And did you struggle as a writer when you were writing the story with that?
I tried. I felt like it was a kind of delicate situation where I wanted readers to have a little bit more of a sense than Margot did that this was not a date that she should be on. It seemed to me that he has sort of like light flags of kind of rude and unpleasant behavior that, to me, kind of like as an adult looking over Margot's shoulder, I mean, she's an adult too, but as like someone with a little bit of distance, you say, okay, this is probably not the guy for you. But he couldn't be so bad that she seems stupid for not knowing that, right? It had to seem possible that, yeah, maybe this isn't the best idea, but it could work out, or like maybe he's also like, they're going to somehow find some middle ground.
And he's not a scary guy, you know?
I mean, I think that's so subjective. I mean, and yet there are points when Margot's scared of him, right? And so I think context is everything. Certainly until the very end, there's nothing he does that clearly says, I'm a bad dude. No. But of course there couldn't be, because then the story would be over because she would get off the date. The problem is there's all these hints, but they never quite add up to something compelling enough to make her leave. And so she moves forward and forward into this situation that becomes more and more kind of untenable.
Yeah. So, and how did you get to the point that you wanted to write the story? Why did you write? Was this your first? I mean, you didn't write a story for this book. You wrote it separately, right?
No, I wrote it. I had written most of the stories at the point that I wrote Cat Person. I had been writing stories seriously for 5 or 6 years, and I was writing before I started my MFA. I started my MFA at a relatively late age. I was in my mid-30s. So I'd been writing before, but I'd done a bunch of writing in my MFA, and Cat Person was actually the first story that I wrote when my MFA was done, so my workshop was finished. So it was the first story that I wrote without kind of an immediate audience in mind. You know, like I didn't think, okay, I'm going to write this story, and the next day, 12 of my peers are going to read it. It was like
because what you do in an MFA, you write stories and then you get criticized by your classmates.
Criticized and hopefully supported and encouraged and all those other things. But yeah, exactly. And so I wrote it then in a moment of what felt kind of like freedom. I had been writing mostly more like some of the other stories and reflections, like more dramatically horror or genre tinged stories. And Cat Person, I wrote, and the truth is that when I started writing it, I didn't know where it was going to end. I actually didn't know if it might end up in one of those different genres with a death or with a monster, you know? And I think part of that uncertainty is where the tension in the story lies, where we don't quite know where it's going. And it was funny when Cat Person appeared in the New Yorker, it was a strange context for it, because I think you do tend to feel like you know the range of possible outcomes in a New Yorker story, where like the date might go well or the date might go poorly, but Margot's probably not going to end up dead, and Robert's not going to be like a literal cat like person hybrid. Do you know what I mean? Like that's not going to happen. Whereas like in the context of the collection, that's absolutely on the table. And so I feel, and that was in my mind when I was writing the story, was that it would be a realist story set among these other stories.
But the funny thing is now that because Cat Person became this big famous story, most people read Cat Person. And this was the image I had of you, that you were writing stories like that.
Absolutely.
Realistic.
Yep. You and everybody.
And everybody else. And then I started to read the book.
Yeah.
And then the first story sort of still has this a very regretful but understandable ending. I mean, it's not, it doesn't have, it's not really horror, you know, it's not like monster.
It doesn't have supernatural.
It's supernatural.
Yeah.
And then, but then the second one does.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's like,
Yeah. Just the reaction.
This is actually, but now that I realize that is your core.
Yeah, no, and the Cat Person is a different story when you read it in that context.
Yes.
I think slightly but distinctly. Yeah, and that was a thing that what made the Cat Person going viral situation so strange to me, and made me feel like in so many ways I was on the outside of it looking in, because the story was having this life that I, was proud of but had never anticipated and couldn't control, and that it was getting swept up in, as you were saying in the introduction, like both these like political conversations, but also like just there was all these kind of stories that were being told about me, or the idea of me and me as a writer, and whether like the readers of the story were respecting my authorship, sufficiently, or if they were mistaking me for like a diarist, right? All of the stuff was going on, and like in my head I was sort of like, you don't even know like how different, like it's going to be a surprise at some point when you read the rest of my book.
Yeah, and you had no idea that this was going to come to you?
Of course not. I mean, I can't even, it's hard to really...
Because you knew the timing where you were putting it out in.
Well, I didn't really. I mean, I wrote the story in April of 2017. And when I try and contextualize that, I usually say that was post the Trump election in 2016. It was post the Access Hollywood tapes. But it was before the Weinstein allegations were public. It was before the Me Too movement had really caught on. And so I wrote the story and submitted it fairly quickly after that, and it sat at the New Yorker for months. And so it was accepted, I think, in October, which was right around when things were starting. So it's possible that they either consciously or maybe like just had a sense that it was the story, the right time to publish the story without having a distinct like plan. They swear to me, and I guess I believe them, because it does seem to me that catching those waves on purpose is almost impossible, that they didn't know either, that they published it and were taken largely by surprise, as I was, by the way that the story ended up moving through the larger culture in the way that it did.
Yeah, because for you, when you were writing it, did you have like a supernatural ending? Is that always a possibility?
I think usually in my stories, that's a possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, because none of this would have happened if that would have been the case.
I mean, the story would have had a very different life, for sure. I mean, I think you change any single tiny element of what happened with Cat Person, and it would all be different. Yeah. That is just it was just kind of a storm of conditions that met and made that story have the life that it did.
Yeah, and in the story that you wrote after all the it was sort of this, it had gone down a little bit again. You wrote another story for the New Yorker about how it was like for you when Cat Person went viral. And there you write, amongst other interesting things, that putting a lot of monsters and supernatural elements in the rest of your stories, the autobiographical questions will be put to an end.
Yeah, and I don't actually.
Is that what you hoped for? Is
I
that
sort of.
were you so?
I mean, I can't say I wasn't sort of hoping that I would feel. I would have that there was a weird conflation that of me with, as you were saying, with Margot, but also just like I felt like I was a part of the story of Cat Person in a way that I didn't really want to be. I didn't engage with it, and I think that by not engaging with it, I ducked like sort of the biggest the wave of it, but I did want to be just a writer rather than like a figure. You know what I mean? Or to have this other role. Oops, sorry. And I think now that the stories came out, I assumed that like people would say, oh, it turns out she's like, and my stories are all personal. Like I don't want to say that they're not, but they're not autobiographical in a lot of really obvious ways. And I was expecting that people would say that, but the truth is, like, I think the people who are committed to the idea of me as Margot didn't really drop that. They were just sort of like, oh, look, Margot's trying to write horror now. You know, like, she's trying to make all this stuff up just to shock us, but we know the truth. And I'm like, I don't know. You know, that story has its own weight, and you can't necessarily, there's nothing to do. There's no point in engaging with it because it's not really about you at all.
Yeah, that's interesting because it could have also have given you a sense of responsibility, which you would maybe like, because it was actually, I think, a very valuable contribution to the whole discussion that was going on. It put some, for me at least, some responsibility with the women themselves. I thought, I'm totally for the Me Too movement, but I thought there was some level of victimizing themselves, luring into victimizing yourself, which sort of, I thought it was a really beautiful contribution. And so you could also see it that way.
No, I mean,
like Margaret Atwood would with her Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great comparison. I would take that any day of the week, for sure. I think that the story's relationship to the Me Too movement is a little complicated for kind of exactly the reason that you're saying, and that the sex in the story is not coercive, and it would be doing an injustice to, like, the truth of the moment and the kind of other allegations and the other questions that the Me Too movement was discussing to claim that it was. I mean, it's not by any reasonable standard. And yet I think the reason that it worked with the Me Too movement and why I feel like the heart of those conversations shared with those is that I actually think that like a lot of the Me Too movement was about women sort of looking at themselves more than looking outward and sort of having a feeling that like things have been taken for granted for so long that were kind of terrible, and that we've done a lot of like brushing things under the rug and shrugging things off and like acting like things were fine when in fact they were not. Yeah. And then I think it's important not to forget that is taking responsibility for something. You know what I mean? That is looking in the mirror and saying, this has been going on and I don't understand how I've gotten myself to this point. And that for me is like Margot has that moment in the story where she's just like, I don't understand how I got here. And like I thought I would have been able to avoid it and somehow I didn't. And it's a moment of reckoning. And I feel like that vulnerability in the conversations that seemed the most valuable and I'm the most sort of proud of having been a part of were people also doing that and being able to look in a really clear-eyed way at the fact that they were kind of baffled and overwhelmed by how they had gotten where they had ended up.
Yeah. Does anybody in the audience want to ask a question about this? Oh, there in the box, yeah.
Is this on? Yeah, these are catch boxes, so we can throw them at you, and then you can talk into them.
What would be better?
So, any questions?
We can like go back and forth, but really don't be afraid. Other than getting hit in the head by a box. There was one over there actually.
Hello.
Hello.
I was wondering what would happen if you are not writing horror or supernatural. What would happen
Like
with your stories?
With my stories? I mean, it's funny. Like I've spent some time since the story has been out, kind of strongly describing it as a horror collection. I think in part because that was an aspect of my writing that hadn't really been recognized before, and that it was important for me in terms of the kind of the tradition that I feel like I'm working in. But the truth is that not all of the stories are horror stories at all. I think almost close to half have stay firmly within the realm of the real. Some of them get more extreme in their language or in their emotions, or get a little just kind of have a slightly different tone, but they aren't all filled with horror. What I feel like they do all share is a kind of, is hopefully a kind of feeling, which is that feeling of mounting dread and of being sort of compelled to go forward at the same time you want to pull back. And I don't think that feeling is at all limited to the space of the horror story. I just think, for me, I think part of the thing that horror did was that it taught me how to tell a story that had a shape and an arc, and that you knew what beats to hit, and that I have seen in myself, and Cat Person is one example of that, but another one is a story called The Good Guy that's in the middle of the book, where it's almost a novella, it's long, and it's almost all internal, and so not that much happens, it's largely in the mind of the character, but I feel like ideally it has the pace of a horror story even so, and that it teaches, that I learned how to move like that by writing horror stories, and now I can sometimes drop the genre elements, which I will then pick up again because I love them, but I'm not fully, sometimes I can write a story where there aren't any horror elements at all, but it has that same feeling. So, yeah, thanks. I'll throw the box.
Participation.
Hi.
Hi. I was wondering if you workshopped Cat Person at UMich, and if so, what the reception was at workshop.
Right, so no, because that was a story that I wrote literally almost a day after workshop, which I think says a lot to about what my relationship with workshop was at that moment, which was stay the hell away from me, I'm tired of hearing from you. Which doesn't mean it wasn't an immensely valuable experience. It was, but I do think, I don't know if you're asking that question because you're interested in workshops or you're in one themselves yourself, but I feel like one thing that workshop does is, especially when you work with the same people over a lot of time, you start to internalize their voices, and you know what they're going to respond to, and you know what they won't, and you know what they'll see in your stories and what they'll kind of slide over. And I feel like I got so much from that, and then it was such a joy to write a story that I felt like the people in my workshop wouldn't that I could just kind of ignore them. And so Cat Person I gave to 2 or 3 of my closest friends who I had been in workshop with, but who I knew as trusted readers of my work, and they gave me some feedback, and my agent gave me some feedback. But in fact, even after it went through the process of the New Yorker, it's a story that has stayed the most the same from the time when I thought I was done with it to when I started giving it to other people. Do you hear something?
And this is a 2-part question, sort of. What was the reaction of UMich after Cat Person became what it is?
I mean, I think it was very lucky for all of us that workshop was over at that point. People were great, I can't lie. I feel like when a writer, and this I think happens every couple of years in an FA workshop, someone will become successful right out of the program, and it's like aliens have just hovered over, sucked somebody up, and everybody else is just left sitting there being what the hell, and so it's hard, but the truth is, because you have professors who are reminding you, and because you know people at different stages of your career, that ultimately the pace is really different, and that the bonds that you form are really strong, and it's great when one of you succeeds, because then that'll be the blurb on this cover of the book of the next person who succeeds, which will happen after, we hope, not too long. So people have been really gracious and generous, but I try not to ignore the fact that it is really hard. I mean, I've been on the other side of it so many times, and that feeling, which is true, that there's so much luck involved in this whole process, and that it's hard, I think, to sort of keep the faith. Sometimes even harder when you see it happen, right next to you, because it's oh, lightning struck, but that's not there's lots more time. Yeah, I don't know. You'll have to ask them. I think they're okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
Was there one moment just after publication where you kind of realised it was becoming something bigger than you'd expected? And just like as a person, maybe rather than as an artist, what was that experience like to be in the kind of eye of the cultural storm for a little?
Yeah, I mean, I have a story about that I wrote about in that essay that you were talking about, but I can tell it again because I just think it's the answer, which is that, the story went up on a Monday, and it was the best thing that had ever happened to me in my life. I had that story published in November, and it was a huge deal for me. I put it on Facebook, my family loved it, everyone I knew was like, congratulations. I tried to buy the magazine, but it hadn't gotten to Ann Arbor yet, like no stores had it, so I just kind of wandered around to a couple different places and then went home. And then, I went out to drinks with my friends, and then it was kind of over, as far as I knew, and I remember having this feeling that was like, so that's what it feels like when all your dreams come true, like it's great, but then it's over, you go back to work. And so that was the case. Like, I was in that space for almost a week. And I think it was on a Friday. I was at a coffee shop with my girlfriend, who is also, was also a student in my MFA program. And we were writing, and she used to work in publishing, so she's a little more sort of has her finger on the pulse a little more than I do. And she was scrolling through Twitter, and she looks up at me and she goes, "Something's going on with your story." And I was like, "What?" And she couldn't quite explain. She was like, "Twitter's talking about it." And I was like, "So, like, what do you mean?" And we kind of got into a little bit of a fight where I was like, "What are you making such a big deal about this? Like, I don't understand." And then I went home, and I got on Twitter, and I was scrolling through and looking for, and I could see, I could search my name and people were tagging me, but I couldn't quite see the scope of it. And then my mom called, and I was trying to explain to her what was happening, and she got on Twitter and she started looking, and then the moment is that she was scrolling and she goes, "Kristen, oh my God, someone Barack Obama follows on Twitter just shared your story. Do you think Barack Obama has read your story?" And then she started crying. And I was like, whoa. And that was the moment that I was like, something that's sort of bigger than anything that I can comprehend is happening. And that was kind of a weekend. And that was, I would say, honestly, terrifying. I would never want to live through that again. I think it's easy now to feel like things worked out really well. It was a very great thing. But I didn't know in real time where the conversation was going to end up. And I saw it sort of, I think rightly, women writing about sex on Twitter, things often end badly. Those, and I didn't know if it was going to be people calling my house and making death threats and I was going to have to move, or if, my family's, I just didn't know. And so I closed my computer really quickly, honestly not quickly enough, but pretty quickly after. And I managed to mostly keep it shut and to stay off my phone for 3 or 4 days. My friends had a group chat where they sent me sort of screenshots of the ones that were just funny and kind of delightful. And I mostly kept away from the rest of it. And then shortly after that, because the story had gone viral, then my collection was out, and so I had to shift my attention to talking to editors and thinking about that. And so then there was another week when my book sold, and then I was like, okay, now what the hell happened? And I feel like I spent, in some ways, the last year of my life just going back and reading some of the think pieces and getting a handle on it. But I still kind of feel like I missed it. And when I talk about sort of the cat person phenomena, I feel a little bit like an imposter, because it's I didn't go through it. I missed it. Of all the women writing short stories at a certain age, I am the one who didn't know really what was happening until it was over. So, yeah.
Was this finished, or did you have the whole collection finished when Cat Person came?
I had most of it finished, and thank God. I can't imagine what it would have been like to be trying to write a whole new book once that pressure had set in. So when the story was accepted to the New Yorker, Asia and I were like, okay, the market for short stories being what it is, you can probably maybe sell this collection for some tiny amount of money, and we will try to do that. And we're like, we'll wait till the holidays are over and do it in January. So at that point, I had a draft of the collection, and it had the same title as it does now. It had the same story was in the beginning, the story that's at the end was at the end, but there were 2 other stories that weren't in it yet. And so when that collection sold to my editor, Allison, one of the things that she said was, I think it could be a little meatier. There are a couple of things I'd like you maybe to try and add. And I had been working on The Good Guy, the novella, when Cat Person went viral, and I hadn't picked it up again. And to her great credit, and I'm eternally grateful, I ended up sending that half of it to her along with some other things, and she immediately was like, finish that. So I had to kind of get back up on the horse and finish the story and keep
about
writing.
The Good Guy.
Yeah.
Because that's also sort of a similar, not a similar story, but it has the same vibe as Cat Person, and as actually also the biter a little bit.
And they were all written around the same time, and now I can't imagine the collection without The Good Guy. It seems like absolutely it and Cat Person are the 2 at the center. But it wasn't there in the original.
I like it that you put your mom in the beginning.
Yeah.
You wrote, how do you call it how do you call this part?
The dedication.
Oh, the dedication. And it's for your mother, and who taught you how to love what scares you.
Yeah. That has a kind of it has a straightforward meaning, and then maybe a little more twist of a meaning, which is my mom was a huge horror fan when I was growing up. She loved Stephen King. The bookshelves were full of pulp horror, and I was stealing them off her bookshelves. From a very young age, much younger than was developmentally appropriate. And she didn't exactly encourage me. I think she wasn't quite sure what her right relationship to that was. My dad hated it. He really thought 11-year-old should not be reading Pet Sematary. And so he would take them, and then I would steal them back, and then there would be a huge fight. Really kind of the core battles between me and my parents when I was an early teenager.
Your mom actually was sort of proud of you.
I think she was proud. I think she felt what kind of a hypocrite would I be, if I said she couldn't read it. And so a lot of other kind of tensions ended up getting filtered through that fight. And now, to my great pride, my dad at some point, in the last 6 months, was like, oh, I guess you were reading all those horror stories for a reason. Congratulations. He conceded defeat, so now I can move on.
Are they still together?
They are not. They are divorced. I don't think it was my love of horror that fundamentally divided them, but I guess we can ask.
Oh, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what do you think, because so you really started to love horror yourself, not just, at some point you get beyond your mother, right? You're like, okay, she's the one who gave it to you, but then, if you wouldn't have liked it.
No, I loved it, and I think she was I don't think I was emulating her exactly by loving it, although maybe that was a piece of it. I think it's just I found it so early that they became just, I think those stories that you grew up with, they were sort of steeped in, they shape you as a writer. And I've always read it, I've always watched horror movies. It took me a long time to decide that is what I'd also like to write. That wasn't an immediate connection at all.
And did it really scare you? Were you scared? Did it give you scary dreams? Did it make you look under your bed?
Yeah, I know because we were talking before about how you love horror, but you're not scared of them.
No.
I love horror movies. I am scared of them.
Yeah.
I just like being scared, or I like fear in that controlled space.
Exactly, because we were talking about that we have a lot of scares for normal things,
right?
And then this is like a refuge almost.
Exactly, right? It's like my overdeveloped startle reflex that makes me terrified to like talk to someone behind the counter at the grocery store. Like that makes me ill-fitted for the normal world, but it makes me really well-suited for the world of a horror movie in which everything is terrifying. And this is like, it's not fully true, but it's a little true, that like I know what it's like to be afraid. I have anxiety, I'm scared all the time. I'm kind of good at it. I'm good at being afraid and like moving through it.
Yeah.
And so a horror movie feels like, in some ways, like a safe place to
A
be.
safe place.
Yeah.
Also, like, well, that's not gonna happen to me.
Right. Well, I don't know.
You know.
Yeah.
So did it also make you want to be a writer when you were a small girl?
I didn't want to be, I wanted to be a writer in sort of bits and pieces, but not consistently until I was older. I really loved reading. It was horror stories, yeah, but really everything. I was a huge reader to the point where I like kind of didn't want to do anything else. Like everything else felt like an imposition. And I understood that if you wanted to read books all day, like it was understood that you would eventually want to become a writer, or that you would just kind of naturally end up there. But it didn't feel natural to me. It didn't feel natural to write. It felt like the opposite of reading, you know, because you read and you get absorbed in the story, you disappear into it, you're not there anymore. But when you're writing, at least at first, you were right there on the page. You get to look at yourself and like all of your flaws and your ego, and it's all there. And so I would, many times like in high school and then again in my early 20s, I would sort of be like, all right, I really hate having jobs. It's time to like learn how to write so I can like follow my dreams. And then I would try and write, and I would hate it, and I would struggle with it and wrestle with it and not really be able to get anywhere. And it wasn't until I was older, into my 30s, that something clicked, and writing started to feel like reading. It started to feel like that kind of dreamy, like storytelling space, yeah. And then once that happened, I was like, okay, this is it. Like, this is what I want to do, and I'll move heaven and earth to be able to have the time and the space to do it. But it took a long time.
And was this before or after you were in the Peace Corps?
It was much after, because I was.
Maybe you should explain it. You were in the Peace Corps?
Yeah. I was in the Peace Corps in Kenya. I went right after college. So I was there, I was 21. I went to the far western Kenya on the border of Uganda, and I did HIV education and public health. Yeah. I don't know. And it was, there's one story in the book that draws like explicitly on my time in Kenya. I think in a larger sense, it's the most formative experience of my life. But its influence on my writing, other than that story, is like a little more subtle maybe. I went to Peace Corps, and I did come back after thinking, okay, I must write about this. Like, I've had this huge experience, how can I try and like understand it for myself and explain it to other people? But I couldn't. I would sit down and like I was working as a nanny, I was 24, I was like, let me write you a story that will explain like the tragedy of aid work overseas, and I just couldn't, it was too much, and I didn't understand this experience yet, I hadn't processed it, and I couldn't use writing to do that, you know, to master something that I didn't understand.
Yeah. And how did you end up there? Why was it from an idealistic drive that you were,
Yeah, I would say I was a pretty idealistic kid. I had a sense of just like, when I was really young, and I don't know, I think there are different answers to why this was true, but I had a kind of overdeveloped sense of responsibility. I felt like the world rested on my shoulders. Like, I say that because I remember it, and also it's like how my parents described me as a kid. Like, I just felt like bad things were happening and someone needed to fix them, and I should be that person. And it felt urgent to me. But I think it was two things. I think it was that. I remember genuinely feeling that way, feeling like, how can people look at the world as it is and not feel like they have to fix it, you know? And also, there was a part of me that was sort of drawn to what scared me. Do you know what I mean? And I felt like I knew I was a sort of anxious person, and the way that I dealt with that for a really long time was when I was scared of something to just ignore my feelings completely and charge forward, because if I listened to them, I'd never leave the house, you know?
Yeah.
So I was just always kind of moving. And I feel like now, to me, like, I went to the Peace Bar, and I was 21, and to me now that seems so young. Like, I'm 37 now, and it's just like, how could I have just, like, gone off and thought I was ready? Because I wasn't ready, and in a lot of, I don't know that I ever could have been ready, but, like, I was completely overwhelmed, and it kind of flattened me. And, yeah.
What happened? Because this was in 21 was this is still sort of the height of the AIDS epidemic, and I mean it still is going on in Africa, but maybe
No, but it was a really particular time to go, and that was another thing that I couldn't understand until later, which was that I went in 2003, and so that was it was the height, like the AIDS epidemic was everywhere, but it was also HIV was everywhere, but the knowledge was also there. Like, people knew. Like, the education had happened. People knew what they had.
there was drugs.
Right. Well, no. They knew what they had, and they knew what was going to happen, but there weren't any drugs. The first ARVs arrived in my village 6 months before I left, the first clinic that started distributing them. And so what I arrived into was a place where I had information that no one needed because they already knew. Like, I'm here to teach you about transmission. They're like, we fucking know, like, this is our lives. But I had no solution to offer. And I think people very rightly were like, well, why are you here? Why did you come from all the way across the globe to say, I don't have anything to give you? And they said it in what was an incredibly kind way. I mean, they weren't, like, it was me who realized, it was just an impossible position to be in. And it was a fundamentally kind of not right position to be in. Do you know what I mean? But I feel like now we have
almost inappropriate.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's hurtful to come and arrive and be like, I'm here, but I'm carrying nothing. I don't know. It still is kind of hard to talk about. And I think now we have a lot more, or at least I feel as though there's a lot more, like, the phrase white savior complex exists, like, that in the public discourse you can have access to, like, information that would help you kind of contextualize an experience like that. But I didn't have that. I mean, it was I went there and I just knew I was overwhelmed, but I didn't understand kind of the nuances of why. And I feel like it took me a really long time to even begin to understand it. So.
And did you leave because you were overwhelmed?
No,
did
no.
you fled it?
No, I mean, I served up, like I finished my service, and, like, I shouldn't talk about it as though it was only a terrible experience. I lived with a family, I'm still in touch with them, their kids just graduated college, like, we did manage, essentially, like, despite my total ineptitude, they managed to use the fact that I was there as a way to, like, build a building that's still there. We figured it out, and I'm glad that I have those relationships and that I went. But it just feels like the larger story of it was just someone being completely unable to wrap her mind around the situation that she was in. And I feel like possibly that sense of, like, moral, I don't know, like, just, like, a deep skepticism that I think is in a lot of the stories of, like, moral certitude and people who are sure they're doing what's right and know exactly what's right and what's wrong, maybe is, in a way, like, was born in that experience.
Because you didn't.
There. Yeah, and because I thought that, like, morality was more straightforward than it was, and it led me to do things that I feel like in retrospect, like, I don't know if I would directly say cause harm, but, like, kind of caused harm. Like, the good intentions are not, the road to hell is paved with them, like, it's not a new discovery. But, like, that being sure that you are right is a really dangerous thing, and being sure that you are good is a really dangerous thing.
Yeah, that's very much in the stories, and what you've done well is that there can become kind of obnoxious quality, right, in a character, but you still sympathize with them in a lot of ways, I think.
I mean, I hope so. I feel like one of the things I'm always trying to do as a writer is, I think it's really, I feel like if you're gonna write a character, you should put enough of yourself in them that you're vulnerable with them on the page. And I feel like you can really tell usually a story where the writer is kind of inviting the reader to stand here and point at the character who is there, and I find those stories kind of difficult, or like I just feel like they're unsatisfying. And I feel like all of my characters, if I'm writing a story from their point of view, they have enough in me that I'm trying really hard. That like the sympathy is there, even if there's also judgment and like deep self-criticism. Do you know what I mean? Like that there's a kind of lack of deeper judgment that hopefully transfers.
Yeah, and there has to be some sort of a form of self-doubt, right?
Oh yeah.
To be able to write.
And just the right amount, I guess.
Just the right amount.
Too much is paralyzing.
And I can imagine that an experience like you had in Africa contributes to that feeling.
Yeah, or like hopefully some humility. I feel like it's the thing that you hope that you get out of an experience like that. But
yeah. Is anybody from the audience have a question? Yeah. There's one right there.
Thank you. This is a strange thing. I'm curious because and I haven't read the whole collection, but when you talk about sort of this horror genre or pulp horror that you sort of grew up with, how was it going to an MFA program? Which of course, I can't imagine that there were many other students writing in the same vein, and I'm just curious to know how that went down.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I should say actually to start that my first experience with workshop was at a 6-week workshop called Clarion that maybe some of you could be familiar with, which is for sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. And you have to write a genre story every week for 6 weeks and get it critiqued. And it was easily the most intense writing experience of my life. Like it dwarfed what was expected of us in the MFA. And there I was too literary, there I was kind of also out of my depth. But the MFA, when I was there, I think there was changing for sure. And that like now the borders of literary fiction and genre fiction are so permeable. And really, I think a lot of times you just see like when it crosses the title changes, so it's like fantasy until it's like reviewed in the New York Times, and then it's like magical realism. Do you know what I mean? Like it's just like it's the same stuff but all mixed up. And I think that people were getting that by the time I was there. Occasionally I would write a story and people would say like they would use the fact that it was horror to like avoid having to comment on it. They'd be like, oh well, I don't really read horror, so I can't say whether this story is working, but I liked this image on page 4 or whatever, which just meant they didn't like the story. I think my experience with the MFA was that it was actually surprisingly diverse in all the kinds of writing that it was bringing, and that it was funny. I felt like by the end of my MFA, at one point, I was like, everybody was planning to write some kind of like fantasy or like ghost story or futuristic thing. So we're kind of having a moment, the genre people, I think. Might have won more prizes if I, had written more traditional short stories. Yeah, anybody else? Yes, they're good.
That's so scary. I've got a 2-part question. The first is when you finish the story, how do you know that you're done with it, that it is finished?
Mm-hmm.
Is it just like there's a moment where it's like the cherry on the cake, or you just got to get on with your life? And the second part of the question is, do you, once they're published, go back, reread them, if you do reread them, and think, still not sure about that bit?
To the second one. Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that's really satisfying about writing a story that is influenced by genre and that has a plot kind of shape is that I often will finish my first draft and be like, bam, here's the monster, or like, I don't know, there are kind of like, there's a feeling of an ending that I like to reach, and it is so satisfying. I start a lot of stories that I don't finish and that I can't quite get to the end, so when I finish one, I usually have a feeling that I know that it's worked. It's rare enough that it feels really good. Which doesn't mean at all that the story's finished, because of course then the editing has to come in. And yeah, you could tinker with a story forever. And the two stories I feel like that have been kind of workshopped the most, and tinkered with the most are two of the oldest, The Matchbox Sign and The Night Runner. And I do still feel like I could have kept on taking out backstory and putting it back in and like touching the ending a little bit so it landed a little differently and like till I died. And you just have to at some point believe other people that it's enough. And there was something else I was going to say about that. Oh yeah, like, and then reading it. Truly, I mostly don't reread my stories, and it's because of exactly that. Because like the more you talk about it, like I swear I have read that selection from Biter 100 times, and now I notice so many things about it that if I had to write it again, I'd just like X out everything. So it's lucky that you're not actually allowed to do that anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. I'm quite a horror fan myself, and I was wondering what kind of good stories have inspired you?
Yeah, a bunch, but the one I always name first or have them when I'm talking about the story is collection of Shirley Jackson, who I feel like is both terrifying and hilarious, which is the hardest thing to pull off, and I love her for that and for many other reasons. In terms of, I had at one point a collection, I still have it, but like I was reading this giant anthology called The Weird, edited by Jack and Ann Vandermeer, which I strongly recommend, that basically pulls like from 100 years of published short stories, and does a brilliant job of kind of like capturing a particular mood of like weird dark horror that I think all of these stories in one way or another kind of fit, like even the ones that aren't genre, they're like uncomfortable in exactly the way that they manage to identify, but they pull from like a ton of different countries, and it's like you just see all these connections between like sort of classic horror and like all these other figures like Kafka and Henry James and Joyce Carol Oates and Jamaica Kincaid has a story in there. That book I was reading, I read actually right before I went to Clarion, and I was like, oh my god, I have to write 6 stories in 6 weeks. I took out that book and I would just flip through it and I'd read a story and then I'd be like, okay, like I would use some element of that and I'd be like, okay, that story has a screaming skull in it, now you have to write a story about a screaming skull, and I kind of like would just to make myself do it, and it was really productive. And so I feel like that book more than anything, although not that many of those stories ended up in the collection, but I do feel like the atmosphere of it really like permeated into the collection. So yeah, thanks.
So do you think that some of your stories which have this supernatural ending could have ended differently now after you had written stories like Cat Person and Good Guy? Because for instance, I love that story about the birthday party. Yeah, sardines. It starts like it's a birthday. It's a very awkward birthday party because it's the party of a little girl and the parents are divorced, and the mother is the organizer of the party, but it's at the father's house, and the girlfriend is also there, and the mother is very overwhelmed. She can't handle it very well, and she's sipping the wine, and the girl is also, she's in an age and in puberty. She's not really good in her skin, so it's all very it's horrible. Very yeah. And then but she has this game that she plays, and it's sort of a different form of hide and seek, where there's a hider. So he hides, there's one hider, and all the other people have to seek that person. And when you found him or her, you have to stick yourself with the hider, and it's until somebody else comes and finds 2 people and has to form. So they form a group, and I thought this is really strong phenomenon, and it's really good. And then at the end, it becomes supernatural, and then the whole group ends up being a sort of beast.
Thriving massive huge splash, not just
and the thing is, they could have had like a totally different ending, right? Where it would still have that sort of, because of the monster, immediately you get rid of all the awkwardness from all the interconnected person, you know.
Now you do
personality.
kind of sound like a professor at my MFA. I did actually know. It's funny because I did submit that story to workshop, and I did have a professor who said, "What if the monster was a metaphor?" And I was like, "The monster is not a fucking metaphor. Like, there's going to be a monster." And we had this big fight. And I think actually, when I think about sardines, I think that the ending is necessary, and I think that like one of the things I really like is subverting the expectation that some of the stories set up that we're going to end in a territory that is just metaphorical and emotional, when in fact, like, I like to keep supernatural elements on the table, and I think that, like, the full horror, to me, writing about adolescence, it's so monstrous, like,
It is
saying.
monstrous.
Like, and it feels like when you're a kid, your feelings are so outsized, they're so ugly, at least I should only speak for myself, my feelings were so monstrous and ugly and outsized.
About yourself? Or?
Yeah, but also about everybody, you know, and everything, and about my parents, and about, my friends. Like, my head was a scary place, and I felt like, but the scale of my life was so small, do you know what I mean? Like, the things I was so mad about were, like, a teacher, you know, not liking something I wrote, or some other, like, a small fight with a friend, or, like, the biggest thing in your life is, like, a divorce, you know, like, is the scale of your world. And I felt like it felt really good and satisfying to me to, like, make literal the ugliness of Tilly, the child's internal world. Like, that her wish won't be satisfied unless the world kind of, like, cracks and bends, which is true to the feeling that I had as a teenager, and I've said this before, but it's like, I remember reading The Stand when I was about Tilly's age, and then, like, and tearing through it, and just being like, yes, everyone in the world is dead. Like, that felt right, you know, like I don't want to read any books about, like, teenagers having problems, like, that was bullshit. I wanted everyone to die, like, and then I was satisfied with, like, how much I felt. And I feel like Tilly is in that space too. But she wishes for the thing, and the thing comes true. The world becomes as kind of ugly as she is, and of course she's terrified. And she's like, I want to just get back. I don't want it. I was just kidding, but she can't.
Yeah. So did it clean something up for you in your head?
You mean like, am I over my parents' divorce now? No, they divorced when I was 19. It was a very different scenario. So you know.
So no, but more about your adolescent period.
I mean, it's one thing that story did, and a couple of the stories did, is they let me think about my teenage self from the perspective of the adults who were in my life at the time, which I never really quite did, which is kind of absurd, you know. Like, I'm close to my mom, I talked to my mom, I dedicated the book to her, but I feel like Sardines is from the perspective of a mom. So Tilly's having all those feelings, but the story that I was actually the most interested in, the core of the story, is like, what is it like to be trying to love someone who's in that moment so willfully unlovable? Do you know what I mean? And that, I do feel like, fleshed out my memory of what it was to be 12, you know, and how hard it was to be around me because I was so hard on myself and so in such a messy place.
So does this make you, now this collection is here, and this is like a grown-up thing for you? That like this is a step towards maturity. Having it all together.
Yeah. I mean, certainly I think publishing a book is it's like being a teenager. Because, like, you just look really, like, I feel like one of the things about being a teenager is, like, you're used to presenting to the world in a certain way, and you're sort of like, oh, I'm a kid, I'm cute, like, people like me, I have fun, and then suddenly overnight you're like, your face is disgusting, and you're mad at everyone, like, your relationship to the world, like, dramatically changes, and when you publish a book, it's sort of the same thing, like, you're struggling, people, like, sort of feel bad for you, but kind of admire you too, you know, and you understand yourself as, like, a person who's straining, you know, and reaching for something, and then you get it, and you kind of, like, all the things that you practiced and all the ways that you knew how to be in the world, like, are kind of not quite right anymore, and you have to relearn how to be a person in the world again, you know? But I think that's not unique to writing, it's just the truth of every kind of, like, big achievement or life stage.
Yeah. And you know you want this, is that, I mean, what is it that you know that you want?
Well, I think it's different in every story. I think, it's a line of dialogue in the first story, I think. But one of the things that I did when I was picking the title is I went through and I looked at all the stories and I found a place where it would make sense for one of the characters to say it to another. And I thought, well, if that's true, then it's an appropriate title for the collection. It's getting at something that ties all the stories together. And I think one thing it often means is just like, you want this is sort of like you say to someone else and you mean me. You're like, you want me. Like, I want, and what I want is for my desire to be returned, and I think a lot of the desire in the book is that way. It's like mutually constituted but also really contested. Like people are forcing it on each other. They want something from someone else, but they can't quite articulate what they want, or what they want is to be wanted and they can't quite say it like the song. Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. Let me end with a few remarks. First, the introduction of Ellen Kraagsbuur will be on our website for you to reread tomorrow at your leisure. Kristen, you will sign books over here. We've taken a little April break, but we'll be back in May with 2 events. On May 13, we'll have Stephen Williams talking about something completely else, blockchain. And on May 27, we'll have an event with Barry Ivygreen about the rise of populism around the world. And I want to thank the Goede Doelen Loterij for opening up their house for us today. Thank uitgeverij Nieuw-Amsterdam for helping us bring Kristen Roupenian. And I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say it, but at this venue on April 21st, there will be an event organized by Nieuw-Amsterdam. I'm looking your way. Am I allowed to say it? That with Michael Ondaatje will be right here. Or the 19th, sorry. On Good Friday, the 19th, right here, Michael Ondaatje. And if you want to be there, go to the good people of Nieuw-Amsterdam, because it's not organized by the John Adams. Have a great evening and hope to see you back soon. And sit well.